morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Ann Dolin, and for the last 25 years, actually next month, March will be 25 years that I've had Educational Connections. My team of tutors and executive function coaches and college consultants have been helping kids to do better at school. And every day I talk to parents who call our office looking for help for their kids. And inevitably, they're talking about grades and they feel like their kids should be doing better. So today, what we're going to discuss are what's going on in households across our area. What is the real reason kids are having difficulty in school? What is it that we should say as parents when we see these issues? And what can you do as a parent to help? And when and at what time to bring in backup for support. So let's take a look at the chat and see what other parents are saying in terms of what's bringing them to this webinar today. All right, so Jessica said, how do I help my child when she thinks that things are hard, math and writing? How to talk to my child about poor grades without yelling and get him to change. Ideas to how to keep kids on track with all the assignments. How to drive motivation, a lack of motivation, and to try harder for better grades. I'm a parent of a teenager who has ADHD. I struggled not to put my expectations onto him. Thank you for that, Bess. Brandon, my daughter with ADHD is having trouble in math. I think I might bite the bullet and try to get her on ADHD medications. My sophomore doesn't want to attend college, even though she's talented. School can be a challenge. My child's in 11th grade and I have concerns her grades will affect her choices in college. Low self-esteem, fifth grader who doesn't care about low marks. College choices, failing grades when the child was previously an A and B student. Motivation, how to get your kid to care more. Child has ADHD. All right, so I'm hearing a lot of motivation and I'm also hearing parents are worried about the future and that choices that their kids make now could affect how they do in college. That is not unique. We hear this from parents all the time. When they do see bad grades, they have those kinds of questions about motivation. They're not always sure how they should talk to their kids about grades, what exactly they should say. They're also unsure if their child improves their grades, should they reward for that? Or should they just punish for bad grades? What is the best way to go? Have any of these thoughts run through your mind? Yes or no? Throw it into the chat. I'm curious. Have you thought of any of these things? When it comes to grades in school today, they're very different than when we were kids. There really is such a thing as grade inflation. And in fact, now an A is the most awarded grade in American schools. And A's are 3 times more common than they were a generation ago. However, this is interesting. D's and F's have really remained the same. So it kind of brings us to that question of what happened to those C grades? When we were kids, a C was kind of average. It meant you were doing okay. It wasn't so bad. But now a C, because of grade inflation, really tells us that something isn't quite right. The student does not have mastery over the content, or their executive function skills are making it hard for them to achieve the grade that they're maybe cognitively capable of. So let's circle back to grade inflation. We'll figure out the reasons in just a bit. So when it comes to grade inflation, why is this happening? First, there's a culture of retakes. When we were kids, the grade you got on a test was the grade you got on a test. And that's not so anymore. In many school districts, students can retake the test. And either they get that new test grade or the 2 test grades are averaged together. So their grade is increased. There are also flexible due dates. Again, many years ago, it was due on that date. And if you didn't turn it in on that date, you either didn't get credit, or if you turned it in late, you might get a grade docked for each day it was late. But now grades or due dates are much more flexible. And in some classes, kids just need to turn in the work by the end of the quarter. There are also limited zeros. That means instead of getting a 0 for not doing something, in many classes, the lowest grade is a 50. So if you consider that 0 averaged in with your other grades versus that 50, that's going to result in grade inflation as well. Now, although, an A is the most reported grade, that does not mean that many kids aren't struggling, because they are. I think now more than ever due to COVID. And so we often see families that call our office and they'll say things like, my child is really capable of doing this, but they're underperforming. And I think some of you mentioned that in the chat before we started. In fact, one mom said, my child was an AB student, but not anymore. Sometimes parents will say, my child's really smart, but she's super scattered, or he's bright, but disorganized. Well, why does this matter? And why do we really care when kids, are capable, but are underperforming? The main reason is because kids can get into this cycle of negativity. We also call it a doom loop, and it's dangerous. So when you get a bad grade, you get criticism from others, usually your teacher or your parents or your caregiver. And when that happens, it kind of results in lowered confidence. And when you don't have a lot of confidence, it results in reduced effort. And we all know what happens when kids don't put effort into their work. It results in that bad grade all over again. And this doom loop is not a positive thing for kids. Without help, they often have difficulty breaking out of it and figuring out another way. They can kind of like stay in this cycle. And that's what we do not want for our kids. So as parents, as educators, what do we do about it? Well, the first thing we want to do is to make sure this cycle of underperformance is broken by being a detective. You kind of have to figure out what is happening. It's easy to say, my child doesn't care. He's unmotivated. He's just not a good student. But if you peel back the layers of the onion, there's almost always something else happening. So, what are some common causes behind poor grades? First, the child doesn't understand the content. We see this a lot in cumulative subjects where one skill builds upon another. And in fact, that happens a lot in math-based sciences in high school and foreign language. Also, a couple people at the beginning in the chat mentioned two subjects, math and writing. And interestingly, both those subjects require a ton of working memory. Working memory isn't your short-term, isn't your long-term memory. It's your ability to juggle multiple things in your head at the same time. And so that can affect academic performance. So sometimes it's an issue with content. They don't understand how to do the math. For example, sometimes it's a child with weak executive function skills. They can do the math, or the other subjects, but they don't always turn the work in, or they do it and they can't find it, or they forgot they had to do it in the first place. They have difficulty with focus and also just execution of a task. Sometimes it's a combination of both. And this is what we see more often in my practice. Parents call and they think that it's a weak executive function skill issue, but often that has resulted when you don't consistently do your work and you don't get the practice. Now, all of a sudden, you don't understand the content. So it can be a combination of both. Sometimes it's also not that the child has a problem, but that they lack goal-directed behavior. A couple people mentioned at the start, that their child doesn't understand how their actions now can affect their choices later, like college. And so sometimes it's, the first few things, and it's this. Sometimes it's just this. It has to do with more of intrinsic motivation, which we'll talk about shortly. And then lastly, sometimes there are mental health issues, and it looks like it's a motivation issue. but that's the result of maybe, an issue with anxiety or perhaps depression. So kids can feel stressed, they can feel anxious, and they can be depressed. And those things will certainly affect their grades. So, questions to ask yourself: is it situational? Like, is it from a divorce, a death in the family? Has it been all the time? Have the child's behaviors and their interests recently changed? Could they benefit from professional help? And so many times it is a therapist that can help them with these things. It's not something we do, but if you need a referral, let me know. All right, so let's circle back to those kids that don't understand the content. Why is this happening? First, they could have a learning difference. They could have a learning disability. This makes, the work much, much harder for them. And when things are hard for you, you don't want to do it all the time. It's easier to get into that avoidance mode because it's painful for you. Sometimes the child may have ADHD, could be diagnosed or maybe undiagnosed. And ADHD, by the way, is not a learning disability. It's a standalone disorder, and this can affect kids. Sometimes the student, though, may have attention issues, but they may not either meet the clinical diagnosis of ADHD or they've never been tested for it. I see these kids kind of like Swiss cheese. I was definitely a Swiss cheese child when I was growing up. And like many girls, I sat in class and I looked like I was paying attention. I was never a behavior problem. But within a few minutes, I was, out in another land. I couldn't pay attention. So when I got home to do the homework, I didn't know how to do it usually. So I would slap down some answers to make it look like I actually tried, even though I had no idea what I was doing. I just wanted to make it look like I had attempted something. And then lastly, as I mentioned, it could be an issue specifically with cumulative subjects. And I see this a lot in kids. The areas that they struggle with are, again, math-based sciences in high school, and also foreign language. These subjects are super hard to teach yourself. So when you see that the child is, having these issues, you cannot say to the child, hey, work harder, pay attention more, just do your homework. If you're struggling in a cumulative subject, it's incredibly hard to pull yourself out of it. If you don't understand math here, it's likely all these bottom skills down here you never got. So to reteach yourself is extremely difficult. And that's why that approach doesn't work so much in math. You can reteach yourself maybe history, but not math, a math-based science, or a foreign language. So when we work with kids that need individualized academic attention, and that's what I would recommend for kids that fall into this content area, and that's what's creating this doom loop, we first want to figure out, what is going on? Why are they struggling in this subject? Because it's typically not that they're struggling just with this unit. They have these gaps down here, and we want to know what they are. And then as we work with the student, we go back and fill them in. However, at the same time, we also help them where they are. And ideally, if you get somebody to help your child, the remedial approach of just filling in isn't a great solution for kids who are not feeling good about school. They also need to be met where they are so that they can feel good about what they're doing at the time. So that means help with homework. It means helping them to study for upcoming tests so they can get better grades in the class they're in. And it means taking those last few minutes of a session, which we always strive to do this, and preview what's going to come next. Because if you can say to the student, all right, great, we did this. Let me show you what you're going to see next in class. Let's go over this together just for a couple minutes. Now, when the student goes to class the next day or 2 days later, if they're on block scheduling, they understand what the teacher is talking about. It's so much easier to focus when you understand what's happening. And research has shown that having a remedial method, filling in the gaps, along with previewing, produces far better outcomes than just filling in the gaps. So previewing is super important. And then lastly, teaching kids how to study. And it's a big part of what we do. I do not think in American schools that we do a great job of teaching kids how to study. We do not do a great job of teaching kids how their brain works. And so we just kind of assume in schools that kids understand this. Maybe they were taught it once or twice, but that is not helpful. They need to practice it over time. And so we make sure that kids understand the primary ways their brain retains information. Let me share with you a couple of things that are super helpful to kids. And by the way, if this is of interest to you, there's a really great website called learningscientists.org. And it details, and it's for kids and teachers and parents, how kids' brains retain information in ways in which they can study most effectively. We at Educational Connections subscribe to that methodology. There's about 6 to 8 ways, but let me make this easy and like pull down the top 2. So one is called distributed practice. We know through lots of research that when kids study a little bit over time, that is better for them than studying at the last minute and cramming. So if you took that hour, you would study on Thursday night, and then you did 20 minutes Tuesday, 20 minutes Wednesday, 20 minutes Thursday, that's going to not only have a better outcome for Friday, but most definitely later on. It helps you with long-term memory because you're sleeping on the information. So ideally, kids are learning in short bursts instead of all at one time. That's how they're going to retain more information for later on. So that's one concept. But actually the very best way to help kids learn information and improve their grades is this concept of self-testing. So self-testing is basically when you take your notes or you take a study guide, or you take some information and you ask yourself the questions. So you cover the information that you need to know and you say, what were the 3 causes of the Revolutionary War? And then you think about what that is, and then you check yourself to see if you were right. That is far better than the method the vast majority of kids use. In fact, a self-report study was done looking at, how kids study. And 85% of kids said they study by rereading. That is not effective. So they'll take their notes, they'll read through them, and they say they've studied. Yeah, I guess they have, but it doesn't help for retention. So instead, you want to ask yourself these questions that makes your brain work hard. If the teacher gives a student a study guide, we have kids make 3 copies. So they're going to fill out the first one, usually in class, or finish it for homework with all the right answers. The next day, they take that blank one, and just by memory, they fill it in as much as they can. Only looking at the answers when they're totally stumped. They made their brain work hard, and then the third day, they do the last copy. So that's extremely helpful. You can also create your own study guide. We do this for kids to help improve their math grades. We say, all right, let's find questions, problems that you've already done where the steps are written out correctly. They could be in your notes. They could be in a book. And then we have them take a couple of those questions, write them out, and solve them. It's like their own little practice test. And then lastly, Quizlet. Quizlet is fabulous. Kids use it all the time. They often will find flashcards that somebody else has made. However, if they make them themselves, that's more of a way of self-testing. It's a better way that will help them improve their grades. So sometimes kids have good intentions of studying, but they don't always study correctly. And sometimes it's the method of studying that results in test anxiety. Sometimes it's just their anxious nature that results in test anxiety. But what I can recommend is that students study in the format of the test. So think back to when you had a really young child and they were studying for spelling. You wouldn't say, all right, Susie, spell the word friend. And Susie spells friend out loud. you would say, okay, Susie, spell friend, and Susie would write it on the paper. So we always want to teach kids to study in the format of the test. And that's why practice tests are so helpful, or self-testing. Also, there's research about kids that are super anxious before a test. And when that happens, your amygdala and the back part of your brain is like on high alert, and your frontal lobe, which controls all your executive functions, it kind of goes offline because you're so worried. But a study out of University of Chicago found that when kids wrote down their worries right before a test, they kind of just did a brain dump of everything they were worried about. That helped them to perform just as well as their non-anxious peers. So I mentioned that sometimes it's not a content issue. It's not a mental health issue or anxiety, but it's due to executive function. So let's tackle that next. You may know a lot about executive functions. Just quickly, executive functions have to do with organizing and planning and prioritizing the tasks that you have to do. I'll do this first, second, third. Has to do with focusing long enough to get the task done, moving on to the next thing. While you do this, regulating your alertness so that you're focused enough, managing your frustration. If you're super upset about doing this in the first place, can you tamp that down and just like power through it? It's that working memory piece I mentioned. This has to do a lot with math and writing. And then it's monitoring yourself. If you see that you're off track, can you get back on track? If you were doing your history and now you've been watching YouTube videos, can you say to yourself, bad idea, let's do history? That's your ability to monitor and self-regulate. So sometimes the kids' issues are really with these areas, not as much knowing the content. So what can you do as a parent? I would recommend keeping the dialogue open with kids. And always talking to them about how they're doing, how they're feeling, what they have going on, not in a punitive way, but just seeking to understand, how are you doing? What do you have coming up? So having a regular check-in time with kids is really helpful. I'll talk about how to do that at the beginning of the week to make sure they're getting off to a good start. You can also check in when it comes to grades. However, this has to be done very delicately. I have a friend who has a fifth grader, and she said to me, this was a few months ago, she said to me, I feel like I'm like a slave to the grade portal. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, I feel like I'm obsessed with it. Like, I'm always worried. She was always worried about her son's grades. And she said, I'm always worried about Nathan's grades. So I go onto the portal during work and I'm looking to see how he's doing. Did he turn everything in? What are his grades like? And I just find myself consumed by it. And then I start getting really angry when I see that he hasn't turned something in or he got a C on a test. And when he comes home from school, it's a bam. The first thing I ask him, like, why'd you get a C? Why didn't you turn that science project in? You finished it. What happened? And she said, I don't want to do that anymore, but I'm worried that if I don't do that, he won't follow through on things. And so I suggested that, if she's afraid of completely going cold turkey, what if she checked the portal once a week with him and he was aware of the day and time it's going to happen? And so maybe they set aside time on Thursday to look at the portal. That way he could explain what's happening. And you wouldn't always jump to conclusions. So you could have a discussion. And your question is, tell me about math. How is it going for you? I noticed that this missing assignment is here. Tell me about that, and let him talk about it. And you don't even have to do anything about it, but just having that discussion is powerful. This works for some students, not all. Sometimes, especially older students, will say, I'm not doing this with you. This is my business, not yours. So if you've tried this before and it's been in a very non-judgmental way, then it might be that there's too much of a power struggle and this is not a good idea. And you try to find something else that you can keep in touch. I think the check-in really, really works. It just may not, it may be hard for parents that have a relationship already defined by academics and there's too much tension, especially with older students. Oftentimes when we work with kids, they allow us to have this check-in because we don't have an emotional history with the student. We're there to cheer them on, to be their coach. So when we work with kids on executive function skills, we'll always go through the subjects in their learning management system, whether it's, I don't know, Canvas, Schoology, Google Classroom, and we'll ask, hey, let's take a look at English. What do you have coming up? How is that going for you? How are you feeling about that subject? And for each class, we have them write down their upcoming assignments and tests. So often this is in their Google Calendar. Some kids will use a paper calendar. And then if something's big, like a science project or an essay or a lab or whatever, and it takes multiple steps, we'll have them put those steps into those smaller tasks into their calendar. We found over time that that approach of calendaring works better than keeping lots of lists for kids. And then we'll say, what's heavy on you? Like, what assignment do you think you're going to procrastinate on the most? And we help them get started on that, hopefully finish that. So at the end of the session, they're feeling really good. And then we talk about the session, what worked well. And we also think ahead. And with when kids have low grades, this is something they almost never do. They never think, what could get in my way of getting this done? What could get in my way of studying for that test? And so we'll talk about that. Like, what could get in your way? Some kids will say, I don't know, I'm binge watching a Netflix series, or I'm always on Snapchat. And we'll talk about ways that they can overcome that when they're in the moment. Snapchat math. How do I make myself get started on math, especially when I don't want to? On your end, on the parents' end, I mentioned that Sunday session. And I love that idea of just sitting down with all your kids and saying, hey, let's talk about the week. What do you have coming up this week? It could be talking about extracurriculars. It could be talking about big things they have. Do you have any big projects, tests, big things that need to get done? Is there anything that you can do tonight to help you prepare for the week? Sometimes, however, for kids, it's really an issue of just being organized. So you could use that time to take 15 minutes and everybody in the household, get organized. I call this a clean sweep. For parents, it could be cleaning out their junk drawer, organizing their home office. For kids, cleaning out their backpack, organizing their digital files. But any of these discussions are helpful in helping kids to prepare for the week ahead. Ultimately, it helps with grades because when kids start the week unprepared, it just filters into the rest of the week. But if they start the week on a good footing, it makes life so much easier for them. All right, so let's switch gears and talk about what happens when kids get a bad report card. How do you deal with it as a parent? First is to give it distance. We don't want to approach kids when we're really upset. It doesn't go well because we're heated and they feel our negative energy. So give it distance. Schedule a time to talk. Say to your child, hey, can we talk about this? Is after dinner tonight good for you? How about 7:00? And ideally, you want to create an open discussion. You don't want this to be punitive. Otherwise, kids will start hiding grades and lying about them. Instead, you maybe want to use words like, I've noticed, math has become really difficult. Tell me about it. Or help me to understand what's happening in math. I'd love to know what's going on your end. And not as, a punitive measure, but more as a collaborative effort to learn what's happening. Because basically we want to be a detective. We want to peel back the layer of the onion to see what's going on. Usually in this situation, a child will be forthcoming and tell you what's happening. They're more likely to do that if you say, oh, I see, I get it. I know, it's really hard. This is a difficult subject. All you want to do is build trust and allow your child to talk to you. Because without knowing why this is happening, you can't help them. Along the way, in dealing with kids as a classroom teacher in Fairfax County Public Schools, and then later as the owner of Educational Connections, I've seen that there are commonalities in questions that parents ask about grades. The first one is, should I set consequences? If my child comes home with a bad grade, should I do something like take their phone away for a month? No video games for 6 months. No weekend activities. You can't go out with your friends. Should I set consequences? And consequences are okay if they're reasonable. Sometimes when we go overboard, like I'm going to take your phone away for a month, and then we renege after 2 days, it doesn't really help the situation. So it can be that there is consequence, but it should be something that is doable for the student as well. In fact, this is so interesting. I was looking through the Washington Post yesterday, and there's a section called On Parenting, and I subscribe to it because it's all about parenting for kids. And there was one article titled, "What Teens Think Parents Should Know About Phones." And the author interviewed maybe 6 or 7 kids about their usage of phones and how their parents have leveraged the phone, how their parents have allowed them to have access, have used it as a consequence. And a couple of kids said that their parents did use it as a short-term consequence. And at first they thought, not like a month, but like a week. And they said, I thought it was going to be awful, but I actually, when I was detached from social media, I realized how much happier I was. So it's just a fabulous article. If you get a minute, I would highly recommend it. And it can help with understanding consequences around digital devices, because that's often our go-to thing. Or should I reward my child? And sometimes parents take the opposite approach. Well, they'll say, okay, you have a D. If you bring this grade up to a B, I will reward you in some way. Now, rewards come in 3 different forms. They can be material, like I'll buy you that sweatshirt you want. I'll take you shopping. It could be an activity. I'll take you for ice cream. We'll go out to your favorite restaurant for dinner. I once had a parent say, I offered to take my daughter to Disney World. This was a 5th grader. She came up to me after a presentation. I'm thinking a webinar, but this was in person, a presentation at her school. And she said, I thought this would be a great idea. It didn't work, and I don't know why. Her daughter had always wanted to go to Disney World, and she's told her, if you get straight A's, I'll take you to Disney World. It worked for a couple of days. She was motivated, but then after a week, it didn't. It's too far out. So the activity has to be something right away, ideally. And then praise. And this is really the easiest one for us as parents, and it's the best one. So that doesn't have to be just like, great job, but it could be specific, like, oh my gosh, I love the way you started your math right after practice today. What a good idea. Or it could be like a high five. It doesn't have to be verbal. A pat on the back. It could be nonverbal praise. But when it comes to rewards, what we do know is they work for short-term tasks. So, for example, let's say you want your child to come down and come down from upstairs in the morning, get ready for school on time, and be at the bus stop on time. You could say, all right, if you come down for breakfast by 8 o'clock and you have your teeth brushed and you're dressed, you can watch TV before school. So that child may need a visual by the mirror or right by the toilet when they get up to go to the bathroom in the morning that says dressed, teeth brushed, 8 o'clock. And maybe there's a clock there or a timer. And so they know they have to do those 2 things, and then they get TV. So we do know rewards work best if the task is easy, the kids can do it, and it's short term. And we also know it's not ideal for long-term things. Like, if you get an A, I'll give you $50. It's too far out. It doesn't work, and the task is incredibly complicated as well. Other commonly asked questions include, what should I do if my child lacks motivation? Motivation is incredibly complicated. There is no one answer. I have never found an instance where I could just flip a switch and all of a sudden the student is motivated. Because motivation comes from different forms, and there are elements to motivation that you have to really have all three in order to be intrinsically motivated. And this actually comes from the self-determination theory, which says that motivation has three factors. It's competence. Can I do the work well enough? So when you have a student who doesn't understand how to do the math, for example, they may lack competence in this subject. So that affects their motivation because they're not quite sure how to do it. Autonomy. Can I do it on my own without micromanagement? Sometimes kids are competent, but if the parent is too involved and the parent is micromanaging every aspect of their work and their grades, it can actually backfire because the child doesn't feel like he or she has autonomy to do it on her own or his own. And then the last one is relatedness. Is this meaningful to me? And this is where we see that goal-directed behavior piece that I mentioned in the beginning. Sometimes kids will say things like, this is stupid. Why do I have to know this? I'm never going to use this in real life. Have you ever used the Pythagorean theorem, Mom? I mean, seriously. And what do you do when the student says that? They're actually all valid comments. So when kids don't see the relatedness, it's hard for them to understand the future. So we often say to them, you know what, you're right. This may be something that you may not use in the future. However, it is part of this class, and this class is important because if you can get a good grade in this class, it gives you more opportunities for college because you have a lot more options if you have good grades. So oftentimes the relatedness may not be there, but you can start to talk to the kids about their future. Other common questions are, how do I talk to my child's talk to the teacher about my child's grades? And I found great success with those words I mentioned before. I've noticed, and also, what can I do on my end? As a teacher, I had parents that kind of went both ways here. They were upset about their child, and some approached me like, I want to be a team with you. How can we troubleshoot this together? And some wanted to put the blame on me. And it was hard for me as a teacher because I wanted to do what was right for the child, but sometimes I felt defensive if the questions were reflective of the job I was doing when I felt that I was really, really doing my best. So I felt like the best conversations I had were when parents told me what was happening at home, because I had no idea what happened at home, what homework was like in that family. So I appreciated it when parents said, oh, this has been taking Sally a long time. Hey, what can we do together to make this easier for Sally? Those things are great questions to ask the teacher. So ultimately, we want to, as parents, be proactive when it comes to grades that we think could be improved. So it could be that, it's seeing the teacher. It could be somebody that helps your child who's just another caring adult. It could be that it's a professional who specializes in helping kids in these areas that can kind of be like a mentor as well to help kids understand how what they're doing now affects their future. And we're happy to help you with those things. And I have a staff of Kathy, Jennifer, and Ann Stewart who are happy to talk to you about your child's struggles and see if we're the right option to help your student. And you can talk to them and schedule a call by grabbing your phone, opening the camera and scanning this QR code, and it will take you to their calendar, and you can schedule a 15 to 20 minute call based on what works for you. You can also see our services on our website, which is ectutoring.com. Also, I want to let you know that if you have a high schooler, next week we have a webinar called Why Colleges Care, what your high school student chooses to do this summer. And that's with our college consultant, Lisa Gastaldi. And she's awesome. So we're going to peel back the layers of the onion of what it takes to get kids into college. and why the summer matters so much, and great things that your kids could be doing this summer, and why now is a good time to get on those. And you can find that information on our website at ectutoring.com/webinar-series. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left. If you have a question, please throw it in the chat. I would love to answer your question right now. So let's go. Let me get back to the chat. And Tina said, oh, Snapchat is awful. Claudia said, are there in-person options for coaching? We don't do in-person. We do all virtual. We found it to be, we did in-person for 22 years. We found virtual to be just as successful. And in some cases, even more so, because we don't have the driving and traffic issues, so we can see kids more frequently. And it is the frequency factor. When it comes to kids with subpar grades, typically, a once a week session may not do enough, but seeing kids for shorter bursts a few times a week is really ideal. So we're able to see kids more. And plus, it's also one-on-one. So we're able to develop relationships. So we just do virtual. Is the phone, okay, Neil says the phone is a distraction. How do we remove it without being a punishment? I'd have a discussion. I would sit down with your child and say, I noticed the phone can be a distraction. What have you noticed with it? Tell me a little bit about it. And voice your concerns and say, would it be helpful if you put your phone in another room for 20 minutes? Or could you put it in this basket before you start math? It may not be that you're going to get to the point where you're going to be able to take away their phone for 3 hours when they do their homework, but you could have a discussion about it and you could voice, that you're concerned. There's actually research on this, and a study out of Stanford found, it's called a tech break, when kids move their phones. So instead of having it like right there with them, just flipped upside down, when they took their phone and they moved it to another room, so not really around them, and they did that for 20 minutes at a time, they still felt like they weren't out of the loop, because at 20 minutes, they even set a timer. They could get up and check their text messages or see who Snapchatted them or whatever it was that they wanted to do. And that was kind of like the happy medium. So they still had time away from their phone, but they were still able to check it. Any suggestions if the child rejects the idea of a Sunday session? And Robert, yes, if that hasn't been successful, I would use the one thing approach. So the one thing approach is asking your child, if your child has, say, a bad grade in math, or maybe history, you might say, what's the one thing that you would really love to get done this week? What's the one thing that would help you to feel really successful? I like the one thing question when kids also come home from school, because often our first question is, do you have any homework? And if you have a child who's struggling, they may say to you no, just not to have the discussion. So you might say, thinking about today, what's the one thing you really want to get done? What's the one thing, if you got this done, you would feel really great about? Even if your child doesn't give you an answer, well, gee, mom, let's see. Well, I'd really like to get that biology done. And definitely, I got to work on that history. I guess the history, it's probably not going to work like that, but it does get their executive function skills, those cognitive processes thinking, what would it be? What's that one thing? And for kids that feel really overwhelmed, asking them, what is that one thing, actually helps to break things down in their mind, and they start thinking in smaller bites instead of like, oh my gosh, I have all this stuff to do. Please share the access to the article. Mary, I have a subscription to Washington Post, so I'm not sure if you have to have a subscription, but if you Google on parenting, you can see it in there, and it was just out yesterday. So I highly recommend it. All right. And you say you cannot access if you're not a subscriber. So I'm sorry about that, Mary. I think you might be able to access just one or two articles. I'm not sure. But you could also just Google that that description and see if you can find it another way, or if there's a similar article out there. My son's motivation is based on whether he feels it will actually be useful in life. It's hard to see the value of a task to be motivated. Cherie, yes, many students are like that. And I've also found that sometimes kids start, like their motivation kicks in when they're a little bit older. Sometimes it's not until their junior year. And all of a sudden they hear their friends talking about college. They hear their friends talking about the future. And I've seen a lot of kids that were like kind of, plodding along, not a lot of direction. And then all of a sudden they're like, you know what, maybe I should consider this. And so they created a college list of, schools that weren't reaches, that they, were schools that they felt that they had a good shot at, that weren't overly ambitious, and they just applied to one or two so that they had those options. So for some kids, especially boys, I would say that it takes a little bit longer to kick in. Sometimes, finding the right mentor can be really helpful. And so many of our coaches also are kind of like mentors to kids, and it can be that other adult that is really somebody who can make it have a big impact. I was like that myself. I was a really poor student all through high school. I was a Swiss cheese kid. I'm sure I had a lot of attention issues. Back then, it wasn't diagnosed as anything. I was just told that I needed to try harder, and that didn't work. It wasn't until I got to college and somehow a college accepted me. But just kidding. I finally did make it to college, and it really kicked in when I found what I wanted to do in life. I knew from when I was in fourth grade, I wanted to be a teacher. I just desperately wanted to be a teacher. And when I started taking classes that I really loved, I all of a sudden became very motivated and an exceptional student. But it wasn't until I got to do what I really loved. Unfortunately, in American high schools, kids have to do a lot of things they don't love. So it could also be in the summer that you're finding things your child's really amazing at. One of my kids, he was an okay student, but he loved video editing. And so over the summer, he took a class at George Mason, and he really, really loved it. And so I started to find things that made him feel great about himself outside of school. And he plodded along. He got to college, and then he got to do what he really loved to do. So finding that thing, it may not be school, but it could be something outside of school. Michelle, my child says he is not doing well in a particular class because he doesn't like the teacher or the classmates. It's a long story, but he was switched into a class mid-semester and always compares it to the other class. We've discussed this happens in life, but he continues not to study, etc. in this subject. What do I do? I would say that many of the kids we work with are I call this personality specific. They are very much, their grades are based on whether they like the teacher or not, which to us is like a terrible way of going about things. But to them, it makes sense. They kind of feel disrespected, or, that teacher looked at them the wrong way, or they don't like how that teacher teaches, and it's unfair. And you're right, to explaining that it is unfair. But if it is just for this one class, I would get help. I do not think if he's got this impression of the teacher and it's already February that it is going to turn around. I would get help. I would, because he doesn't like the teacher, I'd get a tutor probably in that subject. And I would have somebody who can help him do as well as possible. Because sometimes, even if kids don't like the teacher, but they start doing well in the subject, that gives them the motivation to finish the year on good footing. Tips to improve goal-directed behavior. Yes, you can Google goal-directed behavior and you can find lots of ways to help kids. But a couple of things that I mentioned, Mary, is helping kids think about the future. If you have an older child that's touring colleges and your kid that lacks goal-directed behavior is younger, bring them along with you. Let them see what the future is like. Over the summer, give them opportunities to do what they really, really love. If they like animals, perhaps they could volunteer at a local animal rescue. Having kids see what they're good at and enjoying that and talking to them about how that can be their future. It is a lot of conversations. It's not just, that one conversation is going to flip the switch. Kids that do this are also somewhat immature. So often it takes time as well until they can start to see their future. Let's see, how to peel the iPhone from their hands and set them up with healthy eating, sleeping habits. I'm not sure if I have all the answers to this, but I do know that some families will have ground rules for the phone around eating. And, when families are at the table and maybe there are no phones allowed, anytime you can have a meal with your child, a family meal. I know it's super hard to do that, but that has actually been correlated. Time with family over breaking bread has been correlated to a higher GPA. So that could be something that helps as well. Is tablet time a good or poor example of reward for grades? Lori, I think it's fine. I think it can be, but it has to be, ideally it's related to the task they already do. So it could be if you get your reading done, then you can have time on the tablet. It's harder to say if you get good grades, then you can use your tablet, because again, good grades are incredibly complicated and it's over a long period of time. But if it's something short term, it can work. When you get your homework done, you can have the tablet. Sometimes that can backfire because kids will just slap anything down on their paper to look like they've done their homework. And it actually has a reverse effect of making them rush through it. So you could use something called designated homework time, which means, typically kids should have 10 minutes of homework per grade level. So for your third grader, maybe, you set a timer for 30 minutes. And during this time, they do homework. If they don't have homework, they can do their reading. And then they can get the iPad. Or you say, when you get this done, you can have the iPad between 6:30 and 7:30, for example. So that way it's not right after, but it's not that far after. And that way it might also be rewarding. My daughter has a tutor. It seems as that she gets the math, but when she tests, she gets the math in the sessions, but when she tests, she does horribly. I don't know what to do. I notice she does not have consistent performance even through homework. So if the student is understanding it in the sessions and not on tests, it could be that, again, that she needs more practice in the format of the test. It could also be that she's experienced a lot of test anxiety. And figuring out ways to reduce her test anxiety can be very helpful. When kids have test anxiety, sometimes they also have just general anxiety. And if you find that your child, and maybe not in this case, but for other parents listening, that your child is anxious all the time and has created these perfectionist tendencies, that might be when you seek out a therapist who can help as well. So I would say that, it could be that there's still gaps she needs to fill in. It could be some test anxiety. It could be that she needs to study in the format of the test a little bit more. But I would also give it a little bit of time. Math is a hard subject to overcome. It often takes, many sessions before kids are feeling comfortable because they have gaps to fill in. My child gets overwhelmed or simply chooses to leave it the way it is. So Erica, I'm not sure what you mean about overwhelmed, but I might go, maybe it's a lot of assignments that have to be done, or it's a lot of grades that have to be improved. If that's the case, if it's like so much that the student is dealing with, I would boil it down to the one thing, and I would boil it down to the one class. All right, we've got all these classes to worry about. What is the one class that would make you feel so much better if we focused on that one? And kids can tell you, it's this class because of this, or this class is affecting my GPA the most. Or, I feel like I have the capacity to do well in this class. So I would talk to your child, sit down, have a calm discussion, and maybe boil it down to that one class. And then when you boil it down to that one class, what's the one thing? What's the one thing in that one class that you could do to get started? What's the one thing I can help you with? And make it feel a little bit easier for your child. Let's see. Does your college counseling service specialize in kids with ADHD? And the answer is yes. We have Kristen and Lisa both work with kids with ADHD, and both of them have specialized in kids with ADHD or executive function, or students that may be high achievers and their ADHD hasn't gotten in their way, or other ones that it has, and helping them craft their essays to explaining that they can do as well. Let's see, we have a lot of things here. So Tina said our son is very artistic. We have tried to get him into an art type summer fun. I love that. That's really fabulous, Tina. Let's see. My daughter has a lot of school trauma, having been ridiculed by teachers in middle school. Are there any thoughts? Azita, first of all, I'm so sorry about that. You know, sometimes kids feel sensitive, and things that the teacher didn't mean can be taken in a way that wasn't intended. And so I would still have dialogue with her about it. I would maybe keep that dialogue going more than in the average student, talking to her every day. How are you doing? How are you feeling about things? Anywhere I can help. And also reaching out for when you see a student like this slipping, don't wait until it gets bad. When you see like some regression, I would jump in and get help early on. Sometimes kids that are feeling traumatized, they can get into that doom loop faster, and it's even harder for them to get out of that doom loop. So I would react pretty quickly. Let's see. I also feel like kids need to fail in order to experience growth. How do we help them? And yes, I mean, certainly we do not want to prop up our kids too much. If we're always diving in the minute we see a problem and micromanaging things, it doesn't really work for kids. In fact, there's a study on parental involvement looking at how much parents help. And this is so interesting to me, but the more the parent helped, it was actually related to the lower academic performance for the student. And you would think the opposite. You would think the more the parents involved, the better the child would do, but it was the opposite. Because sometimes when kids think, oh, my mom has to be sitting with me, especially at a young age, to help me, they don't think they can do it any other way. They don't think they can do it independently, and that's what we don't want. So I personally think having a dialogue, tell me how you're doing, how are things going, what's on your docket tonight, what are your priorities tonight, is great for an older student, and let them go about it. For a younger child, it might be helping them to get started, making sure they understand it, and then walking away. But I would agree, you don't want to take the approach that, I already went to 10th grade. This is your school, not mine. You deal with it, and just completely back off. That is not a good idea, because if your child's having difficulty, you need to know about it. So if your student is having difficulty and you see that it is in an area that they're unlikely going to be able to dig themselves out of, that's when I would get help. If you see that it's across the board executive functions, I would get help with that too. It doesn't mean that you're overly supporting them. It does mean you're overly supporting them if they have too much help. We're not talking about too much help. We're talking about the right amount of help so that they can gain confidence back, feel confident, and feel like they can do the work, and that in themselves will help them to succeed. All right, I know that we're out of time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I hope you found this to be helpful. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and I wish you all the very best for the remainder of the school year. Thank you, and bye-bye.